And as I said, Dr. Martin L. Pall, if I'm saying that right, Professor Emeritus at Biochemistry and Basic Medical Sciences at Washington State University. Are you there with us?
I am indeed.
Awesome. Well, thank you so much for calling into Freethinker Radio. I was just giving you a brief introduction, but if you would go ahead and let our audience know a little bit about your background and your work, we can get into it.
Okay. Well, I've worked in a number of different areas, including in environmental medicine, and got involved in how electromagnetic fields impact the cells of our bodies, and have now published 8 papers and planning to do a couple more in the near future on what the health consequences of this are. And it's a really huge breakthrough. And so I think probably what we should do is talk about how these electromagnetic field EMFs work and what the kind of factors are that cause them, some of them to be more active and more dangerous than others.
Yeah, that sounds good. Before we go right into that, could you tell the audience, so when you're talking about this specific topic, what types, are we talking about, would this involve cell phones, wireless, obviously, I reached out to you about 5G, but what does it all relate to? Okay,
well, all the wireless communication devices are relevant to this, and they all cause effects. So cell phones, cordless phones, cell phone towers, Wi-Fi, smart meters, radar, all these exposures have effects. And, we have what are supposed to be safety guidelines that are supposed to protect us. But, in fact, the safety guidelines we have in the U.S. and in Europe and in various other parts of the world are not really worth the paper they're written on. They don't really tell us anything about safety, and that's one of the great tragedies here.
Yeah, okay, well, so now we've cleared that up. Go ahead, I guess, then, and let's get further into the effects, how it works, and we can dive deeper into the whole topic. Okay.
Well, let me just say there are quite a number of different types of effects that are produced by many of these different EMFs, not just one or two, but all kinds of different EMFs. And they include effects on reproduction of almost all types. We get lowered male fertility, lowered sperm count, lowered sperm quality, lowered motility. You get lowered production of eggs in females. You have changes in the structure of the testis and the ovaries. You have increased spontaneous abortion. We have lowered levels of each of the 3 types of sex hormones, and you also have lowered libido. So everything from one end of the system to the other is impacted by these EMFs. And these are already far along in our societies, the reproductive effects, and that's one of my most important concerns, actually.
So one question I have is, so are the dangers and the potential hazards from this type of technology, is it specifically related to the radiation, or is it the heating, or is it both? Could you talk more about that, like where the danger comes from?
Sure, okay. So the safety guidelines only protect us from heating, but in fact, all of these things work in a different way. It's been known for well over 40 years that there are what are called non-thermal effects, that is, effects that occur at levels of exposure that are insufficient to produce any substantial heating. So those are, so we've known for a very long time that there are these non-thermal effects. We just didn't know how they worked. And so basically that's where I came into this thing. I discovered how they work, not based on my own experiments, but on things that had been published in the literature, which people really hadn't realized how important they were. So why don't we talk a little bit about how the system works? As I think probably your listeners know, each cell in the body, we've got something like 10 to the 12 cells in our bodies, and each cell has a membrane around it called the plasma membrane, and that separates that cell from everything else. And in the plasma membranes, there are certain channels that are called voltage-gated calcium channels. And so those are the things that are actually activated by the EMFs. And what happens is that those channels open up, and they allow huge amounts of calcium to flow in the cell. And it's the excess of calcium in the cell that causes all kinds of problems. That's where all of our problems, or almost all the problems that we see, come from. So basically, normally the calcium levels in the cells are kept quite low. And so there's about 10,000 times as much calcium outside the cell as inside the cell. You open these channels and you get huge amounts coming in, and they cause lots of problems. And that's the biochemistry and physiology of this is well known. So we know what that does from all kinds of from many thousands of studies, and basically all the effects that we have can be explained through that mechanism. So we talked about the reproductive effects briefly. There are also major effects on our brains, and the whole nervous system is very, very sensitive to EMFs. And so you get large amounts of neurological, neuropsychiatric effects that are extremely well documented. So we know they occur in response to many different EMF exposures, including all the ones that I mentioned before. And so those are a major problem.
I want to talk a little bit more about some of your other research. Thank you for all those great points, first of all, for bringing that information in. We're definitely, I think some of the audience is new to a lot of this information. We've been talking about 5G and some of the growing concerns about that for the last 6 months or so. Houston is one of the first places, what Verizon declared, in the city of Houston declared the world's first 5G customer back in October, right here in Houston. So it's been, something that many people in our audience are concerned about and have questions about. So we wanted to get into this. I'm looking at a paper from you in environmental research titled "Wi-Fi is an important threat to human health," and it says here from the highlights, 7 effects have each been repeatedly reported following Wi-Fi and other EMF exposures. So, as you said, this has to do with cell phones, 5G, Wi-Fi, some of the things that are already normalized in our society that people are using every day, probably without ever thinking about these potential concerns. When somebody's hearing this for the first time, they might say, well, if this is the case, the FCC or, some government agency would have regulated this or would have made sure this didn't happen, or I would know by now. What do you say to those concerns, or others who point at other studies where the claims of cell phones and things like this being safe?
Well, okay, you asked me a whole bunch of questions here. Okay, so let me just say, first of all, the FCC has done absolutely nothing to protect us. And that's true of the other regulatory agencies in other parts of the world as well. Basically, what happened was that the industry, the telecommunications industry, set up an organization which goes by the acronym ICNIRP, which stands for International Committee on Non-Ionizing Radiation Protection, and they set up some guidelines that are supposed to protect us, but in fact they don't. And we know that from extensive studies that have been published by independent scientists. There are actually 7 different well-documented types of evidence, each of which show that the ICNIRP guidelines, and which are essentially the same as the US FCC guidelines and the European Union guidelines and the British guidelines and the Canadian guidelines and so forth. They're all essentially the same, and we know that none of them protect us from these EMFs. So all the claims of safety are based on meeting these guidelines, and the guidelines are basically useless. And that, so that may be surprising, but that's the case, and so there's a lot of evidence that these things are causing problems. And let me just say that almost none of this evidence comes from the U.S. We quit funding the studies of this sort back between 1986 and 1999. We've done almost nothing since then. So basically, the U.S. government's been pushing these technologies at the same time doing absolutely nothing, or almost absolutely nothing, to protect us. And so the studies that have come out have come from other countries. None of them have come out from this, with the single exception of the NTP study that was demanded by the Congress, and that was about cancer. So we have all these effects. We know they occur. We know that many of them, not all of them, but many of them tend to be cumulative and become much worse with exposure. Sorry?
Oh, no, sorry about that. We're listening. Well, I wanted to just, if I could briefly mention there, you were talking about the NTP study from 2018.
Yeah.
One of the concerns, well, I don't want to say concern, this is more of a criticism, because this is something that I've been talking about as well, and we've mentioned on the show. I often hear people remarking and saying, okay, well, if you look at the study, they blasted the mice, I believe, with high dose of radiation for hours on end that people see as unrealistic or not typical exposure, which I would question, because we know that more and more people are we're surrounding ourselves with computers and with cell phones, and when we talk about 5G and the installation of thousands and thousands of new small cells and towers, there will be that higher exposure. What do you have to say, though, to that criticism of the NTP study?
I think you have to look at the NTP study in the context of all the other studies that have been done. I think the idea that the NTP study is somehow unique in this thing is simply not right. There are, and I wrote a 90-page document, and I have lists of review articles on EMFs causing, each of 8 different effects, actually. And one of them was cancer. There were 35 review articles that have been published since somewhere in the 1970s to the present, each of them arguing that EMFs cause cancer. And so the notion that this somehow or other is new or unique is simply false. The second thing is that there are also a very large number, I think there are 21 or something, studies that show that they're DNA effects. That is, that the EMFs, through the production of free radicals, attack the DNA of our cells. So they get attacked in ways that we know cause cancer in other situations. So there shouldn't be any surprise that EMFs cause cancer, but because we know the EMFs cause these DNA changes, which do cause cancer. So I think if we didn't have the industry propaganda out there all over the place, this would have been accepted decades ago that EMFs cause cancer. And the problem is we've got all this propaganda that we've got an extraordinarily powerful and wealthy industry that's putting out propaganda that simply has nothing to do with the science. So that's one of the problems. And let me just say, cancer, in my judgment, is down around number 4 or 5 on my list, and it may even be lower than that. There are other things that I'm much more concerned about. But obviously, cancer is an important thing, and I'm not saying that it's minor. It's not. And so, for example, there was a review article on people living near cell phone towers, and that came out, I believe, in early 2018. And in that review, they state that there is a remarkable increase in cancer in people living within 400 meters of a cell phone tower. Well, 400 meters is a long way. And probably about half of us live within 400 meters of a cell phone tower. So, this is, I mean, it's absolutely stunning the crap that comes out and the propaganda that people, that the industry puts out.
Yeah, and this would be, some of these would be, like, for example, what people call the big wireless lobby, like the CTIA, the Cellular Telephone Internet Association, are a big part of promoting 5G, for one. And, you talk of these conflicts of interest. I think this is probably not something completely surprising to our audience, even if they, don't know the specific details. Have you yourself, I mean, obviously you're publishing these papers and these studies, and you're looking at this information. I see that you've written letters to California Governor Jerry Brown. You've written letters to the California legislator themselves. Mm-hmm. Do you personally receive pushback, or because I can say as a journalist and as doing this radio show and putting out videos and content about this, people essentially see it in the arena of quackery, and you don't understand science, or you don't understand how radiation works and things like that. Can you speak to some of that?
Yeah, sure, I can speak to that. Let me just say, I got my bachelor's degree in physics, and I got my PhD in biochemistry and genetics, both from, world-class institutions. And you, in order to understand the EMFs, you really have to understand both the physics and the biology and the way they interact with each other. And I am fortunately in a situation where I can do exactly that, and where the mechanism which I discussed, that I kind of briefly outlined to you, is supported both by the biology and the physics. So, and the first paper that I published on this has now been cited, I think it's 218 times. So there's a lot of people paying a lot of close attention to this. You don't get that kind of attention if this is not very good, important work. And so, I don't think there's any question that the scientific community has found this to be a very important breakthrough in our understanding of this. Now, that doesn't mean everybody's bought into it, but I think certainly many people have. But now, you ask the question, well, what kind of pushback do I get from the industry? Up until about, 8 or 9 months ago, not much. Now they're pushing back. They're trying to push back hard. They really don't have any evidence, but, when you've got a multi-trillion-dollar industry, they can create a lot of problems. And so that's the world that I have to live in, and that's the world that we live in. So anyway, I don't know if that answers your question. But
yeah, that does answer the question. One more that I have related to the specific science of it, and then I want to get to some solutions, because we love to talk about solutions and try to empower our listeners, especially locally. As I said, Houston is kind of the forefront of this. Another claim or criticism that I hear is that, well, I don't understand that, directed at me, I don't understand ionizing and non-ionizing radiation, and that non-ionizing radiation has no detrimental health effects. How would you respond to that?
Okay, so non-ionizing radiation is okay. So let me put it in a slightly different way. I talk about electromagnetic fields, and that's important because when you think about radiation, and they're all basically the same, but when you're thinking about radiation, you're talking about the individual photons that make it up. And the fact is that the individual photons that make up non-ionizing radiation, particularly in the microwave and lower frequency ranges, don't have enough energy to influence the chemistry of our bodies. That's true. They don't. But we're not talking about the individual photons. It's the fields as a whole. And those fields as a whole put forces on a structure called a voltage sensor that controls these voltage-gated calcium channels. And that structure is extraordinarily sensitive to these fields. And that's why you get activation of the voltage-gated calcium channels, and why you get excessive calcium in the cell. So we know why the system works. We know why it's so extraordinarily sensitive. And the industry's been claiming that these fields are not strong enough to do anything. But the reason the industry's wrong is because this structure is extraordinarily sensitive to the forces of the EMF. So this comes straight out of the physics, and this is where the physics background that I have has been very valuable, in addition to understanding the biology.
Awesome.
Anyway, I don't know if does that answer your question?
Yeah, I think that does, and I do appreciate that because, as I said, those are some of the two common criticisms that I hear here. Either it's just a misunderstanding or a misinterpretation of the science, or that a misunderstanding of non-ionizing and ionizing radiation.
No, that's definitely not true. In fact, I started out my first paper stating that the individual photons do not have enough energy to impact the chemistry of our bodies, and then asking the question, well, okay, so how do we get these non-thermal effects? And no, I'm certainly not hiding from the physics. I'm certainly not hiding from the science, and it's very important for people to know that both the physics and the biology are pointing in the same direction. They confirm the same mechanism, and so any claim to the contrary is simply false.
Well, I appreciate the clarity on that. So as I said, we're here in Houston, Texas. We have our mayor, Sylvester Turner, has actually been awarded the 5G Wireless Champion Award by the CTIA for his work to contribute to the rollout of this. And it's become quite controversial in our city. It's something that we've tried to raise awareness on, and others have. And one of the things that I've actually mentioned at City Council is that in 2018, Project Censored named their top 4 censored story of the year an article by The Nation about how big wireless convinced the U.S. that cell phones and 5G and these things are safe. So this is obviously an issue. As you said, there are conflicts of interest. There's big moneyed interest who stand to lose if this kind of thing becomes common knowledge. And obviously if people start looking at their own health effects and asking, where did this come from? What is my exposure to this, and how might my health have been affected? So I appreciate all the insights and clarity on that. Again, I want to ask what type of advice, if you can offer any, I know this is maybe not your area of expertise, but what people might take, what type of approaches, or what information they should use. Obviously, I'm going to link to all of your articles when we put this out, but just any kind of advice you can offer to people who are trying to spread awareness on this.
Okay. let me just, I think we've missed something, or several things actually, that are pretty big before I can get into that.
Sure.
That we ought to talk about. Okay. So, I really haven't talked, so I haven't said anything about 5G, and as I think I am extraordinarily concerned about 5G. And I believe the 5G will be vastly worse than the exposures that we've already had from before 5G. And they are quite serious, as I've just stated. We do have, major effects on reproduction, on our nervous systems, including neurological, neuropsychiatric effects, and probably also other things, like for instance, on the neurodegenerative diseases like Alzheimer's, and on causing of autism and ADHD as well. I think we have many very serious concerns about these technologies, completely apart from 5G, and a lot of these effects are cumulative. That is, they tend to get worse and worse with further exposures of the same type, just longer times of exposure. And that's true of the effects on the nervous system. That's true of at least some of the reproductive effects, and it's true of a number of the other effects, including some things we haven't talked about, like the cardiac effects, and at least some of the hormonal effects. We haven't talked about those either. So there are lots of things that, and let me say, the mutational effects are inherently cumulative, and so they tend to get worse and worse just because you pick up more and more mutations from the attacks on our DNA. So all these things are serious issues. Now, in order to understand 5G, you really have to understand something more about what microwave frequency EMFs do, and what kind of factors make one microwave frequency EMF more dangerous than others. And one of those factors is the level of pulsation. So so all the wireless communication devices communicate via pulsations, And in general, what has been found is that the pulsations make them much more dangerous. And so if you have a pulsed EMF, something's going up and down a lot, it will produce much more effects in most cases than do a non-pulsed EMF of the same average intensity. Now, we know that from many, many different studies. Now, part of the problem is that the safety guidelines do not take into consideration the role of pulsation. They simply are based on average intensities. And so we know from that fact that the safety guidelines don't protect us, because these EMFs that we're exposed to all the time are, in most cases, very highly pulsed. And the smarter the device, the more it pulses. One of the problems with 5G is it is designed to be extraordinarily highly pulsed, much more highly pulsed than anything we've had before. And that is, I believe, one of the issues, and probably, a really core issue with regard to the dangers of 5G. And it's completely ignored by the industry. It's completely ignored by the FCC. And unfortunately, most of the news media have completely ignored it as well. And so this is an issue of absolutely crucial importance.
And the pulsing you're describing related to 5G, this is due to the low latency of 5G, where they're saying it's going to be extremely fast and help with everything that's been promoted. Yeah,
exactly. 5G is designed, first of all, to use higher frequencies, what are called millimeter wave frequencies, than the microwaves. And one of the things is the higher the frequency, the more it can pulse, and so the more information that can be carried per unit time. So the whole point of 5G is to carry extraordinarily amounts of information quickly. And the basic problem here is that very pulsation makes it vastly more dangerous. And this is why, what I've argued is that we need to test true 5G biologically for safety, and to see what effects are produced by true 5G. When I say true 5G, what I mean is 5G is designed to be, this extraordinarily high frequency, communication with what's called the Internet of Things. All these things will be communicating back and forth through 5G antennae. That is what has to be tested. And you can even argue we didn't even know how to test it. But what we know is that nobody is even trying to test it. The idea of putting out 5G antennae all over the place without doing one single biological safety test is, in my judgment, insane beyond belief. But that is, in fact, what's being done, and it's what I take it is being done in your city.
Yeah, absolutely. And we had talked about this recently, that State Senator Richard Blumenthal, he is actually one of the few politicians who's been trying to speak up about this. And in his words, he said, we're essentially flying blind because the FCC is not taking in these considerations that you're mentioning here, or at least unwilling to speak of them publicly.
Yeah, that's true. And let me just say, I gave a presentation to the FCC back in September 2016, and I told them about the problems that we're facing, and they just completely ignore it. So they know about this. They're not ignorant about it. And, of course, this stuff's not just going on in the U.S. It's going on all over in the technologically advanced parts of the world, and even some not so advanced parts of the world.
It's part of the global race to 5G, right?
Well, yeah, it's a global race towards complete destruction, in my judgment. I think we'll be destroyed by this very quickly, and I think we'll be destroyed because of the effects on our brain function, which, as I've said before, are cumulative. And on our reproductive function, and much of those are cumulative as well.
Is there any way to predict or to say with accuracy as far as you said it's a cumulative effect, so obviously the higher exposures, and so we're talking about laptops, cell phone, smartphones, smart houses, the 5G small cell towers everywhere. Is there any way to predict with that amount of exposure how many years till people are seeing these different effects?
Well, what the only way we can predict is by looking at what data we have. And we do have data, both from animal studies and from human occupational exposure studies. And most of those occupational exposure studies were done back in the 1970s and 1980s, when we had, when we didn't have all this stuff in the environment, but you could look at how particular people are responding that are exposed as part of their environment. And so we do have data on those things, and I've made some rough estimates about how fast I'd expect, for instance, our brain function to collapse in response to the EMFs. And this is based on the EMFs we already have, completely apart from 5G. And I've estimated, and I have to say this is a very rough estimate, and I want to emphasize that. I estimate that in something like 5 to 7 years, our collective brain function will collapse, in which case we'll go into utter chaos. My prediction is that 5G will speed that up tremendously. I think that in terms of reproduction, I think it may be even slightly faster than that. And let me just say, well, one of the things I'm expecting, so we have a lot of information about the effects on both human reproduction and animal reproduction of the EMFs. And the fact is these things are going on, and we know that. And, of course, the industry denies everything I have to say. But the data is very clear on that. And what you so what I estimate, there was a study that was done 21 years ago, was published in Mice by Magris and Xenos, which showed that, and mice have a gestation period about 30 days, so they can go through produce litters very quickly, and it was shown that you put mice in little cages on the ground in an antenna park, where the exposures at ground level are well within our safety guidelines, and what you find is that within the first litter that's produced, when you put them there, is already depressed in numbers. So within 30 days, there's a depression in reproduction, and you go on and you look at the second litter, and that's depressed. And at the higher level exposure, they looked at actually a couple of exposures, they found that there was no third litter. Think about that. A crash in reproduction to zero within something like 90 days. At the higher level exposure, again, the lower level exposure, again, well within our safety guidelines. Basically the same pattern, except it was the fifth litter that crashed to zero.
I think that what you say there, sorry to interrupt, makes a good point as far as back to the thought that the FCC will take care of us, because folks will say, well, the FCC has standards for these types of things, and we've talked about before how those standards were last implemented and tested in 1996. Were those original standards?
They were never tested.
Well, are those? What I was going to get at is, were those 1996 standards themselves, though, found to be safe? Even because you said we're already within the guidelines, and you're still finding detrimental health problems.
No, they were never tested. The claim that they were tested just isn't true. We already had evidence that the standards were bogus when they first came out. But the other thing is that we already knew that the pulsations were important when they first came out, and they weren't considered. The standards are based on average exposures over a 6-minute period, or in some cases a 30-minute period. And yet we know that we can get little tiny short nanosecond pulses, things like 10 nanoseconds long, that produce effects. There's a literature on this showing. So why are we averaging them over 6 minutes, which is 36 billion times longer, when we know you can get effects in 10 nanoseconds? It's insane. I mean, this whole thing is crazy. And so the safety guidelines make no sense whatsoever. And they have been shown to be false. And the Magris and Xenos study is just one of many studies to show they're false. There are literally thousands of studies to show that the safety guidelines are false. And there were many of those studies that were known already before they, back from the 1950s and 60s. I mean, there was a review that was published in 1971 by the U.S. Office of Naval Medical Research that listed 2,300 citations, and at least 1,000 of those showed that there were non-thermal effects. That is, there were effects that occurred at levels well below our current safety guidelines. Back in 1971, we knew that. So this notion that these safety guidelines are meaningful is just a complete falsehood. It has nothing to do with the science.
Are there methods that can protect individuals from exposure to this? I mean, obviously, again, the big problem with 5G is that individuals don't really have a choice. Like, so the city of Houston wants to roll it out, and whether you're against it or not, they're going to start putting the small cells every 500 feet or even closer.
Yeah.
What can an individual do, if they can do anything, to protect themselves within their own home, or I guess when they're going out to places where they're going to be exposed?
Yeah, I mean, you can protect yourself in your own home. It's not always easy, but you can do it. The problem is, you just stated, is when you go out, what do you do? I don't know, so, you can put shielding in your house. People use, one kind of shielding that's used is graphite paint. So graphite is a black carbon compound, and you can paint your walls with graphite paint. Of course, you don't want to look at black walls, so you paint something over it, so you don't have to look at black paint. But there are ways of doing this, and there are things you can put over your windows. Those are more expensive, but there are fabrics that you can put in that have lots of little metal fibers in them that that shield your windows. I mean, so you can use these as curtains, for instance. And so there are ways of protecting yourself. You can protect yourself to some extent just with aluminum foil. The problem with aluminum foil is that it doesn't absorb it; it just bounces it somewhere else. And so the consequences of that depend on where the aluminum foil is and where you're bouncing stuff. And when you put up aluminum foil, say on your walls, you both bounce away radiation coming in from outside, but you also keep radiation that's inside, that's being generated by your own devices. You keep that inside, and so it just bounces around in your home, and you get exposed to that. So things are a little tricky, but there are things you can do. And even if you live, for instance, in an apartment complex where you're getting lots of Wi-Fi from and other radiation from people living around you, you can put shielding up, and you can also, if you need to, put shielding up in your ceiling and in your floors. Let me just say that there is some concern that by keeping yourself away from the EMFs that occur naturally in the ground, that's problematic. And I do share some of that concern, but I also think that what we're being exposed to is so dangerous that at this point we need to do what we can do to protect ourselves. And that's, again, completely apart from 5G. That's true. And there are, by the way, building biologists who know how to deal with these issues and are trained to do that. And so in the Houston area, but I'm sure there are there are people that you could probably find out if there are building biologists there that can help. I don't know. I think one of the things that we really need are shielding in our cars and other vehicles. That's a big issue now.
This applies to Bluetooth, right?
I'm sorry?
This applies to Bluetooth, right? So when somebody's sitting in their vehicle listening to Bluetooth on music.
Yes. That's exposing you to radiation. Yeah. That's true. Mm-hmm. And there are other things that expose you to radiation that we haven't even talked about. Like, for instance, there are a lot of electronic devices that generate what's called dirty electricity, where where our power wiring, which normally is supposed to have a nice simple 60 cycle sine wave on it. If you look at it, actually, what it looks like, it's not. It doesn't look like a sine wave at all. It's got all these jagged things going up and down on it. That's called dirty electricity, and it's generated by a lot of electronic devices. And so there are ways of lowering that, but so that's another thing that one can worry about and should worry about. But and let me just say, when you get, for instance, say you live near a cell phone tower. The cell phone tower itself not only radiates you, but it's using a lot of electricity, and it generates a lot of dirty electricity in the wiring. And that dirty electricity then can come into your house from outside. And then you get irradiated from that as well. Same thing is true for smart meters. They generate a lot of dirty electricity, and you get that as well. So we're doing an absolutely horrendous job of protecting people from this stuff. I mean, it's just lunacy what's going on.
It sounds so. I mean, I don't really know how to put it other than both disturbing and hilariously sad that we're coming to a time and a place where you're telling me that the long time joked about tinfoil hat might be some sort of solution. Not to make light of this, but I mean that's literally where we're at now, where people are going to have to think about how to protect themselves and their families from so much exposure. And that's what I was getting at earlier with solutions. Obviously, giving people some defensive tools there. That I appreciate that, and I do think those are things that are new to me as well, as far as painting your house with graphite.
Yeah. There are, by the way, there's shielding clothing that you can buy, and they typically are clothing that have, again, like the curtain material that I talked about before. It has lots of little metal fibers in it, and so you can wear shirts, and you can wear underwear, and you can wear you put something over your head that can shield you. I think at some point, of course, it makes you look like hell. But
yeah, you're not going to be getting invited to any dinner parties. That's for sure.
Yeah.
Well,
so, yeah.
I want to ask you, would you be willing or interested, and this is something we could talk about more off air, but would you be interested to send some of your data to our city council and to our mayor, who has been, the only statement he's released publicly is, "I love 5G." He is, like I said, the CEO of Verizon came out here to Houston to hold a press conference with our mayor, and he's been given the CTIA's 5G Wireless Champion Award. He's obviously very close and connected with them, but we can go there as citizens and concerned people and journalists and whatnot.
Yeah,
but I think that your word might add some weight to it. Is that something you might be interested in helping out with?
Well, I mean, I can give you some materials. I mean, some of my materials are available on the internet, and you can just download them and send them anywhere you want. But yeah, I can sort of lead you to them. If you'd like. I've developed a lot of materials that I've used for a lot of different things, and I have a document, for instance. I've been telling you that the safety guidelines are useless, and I wrote up a document specifically about the FCC guidelines, showing that there were 7 different types of repeatedly found evidence, each of which show that the FCC safety guidelines are useless. And that's but really, the FCC guidelines aren't really much different than the, as I said before, the European Union guidelines, the Canadian guidelines, and so forth, the ICNIRP guidelines. They're all pretty much the same. So they all have the same flaws, and they all are basically fictional. They simply do not protect us from EMFs, and we know that from all this evidence.
Well, I very much appreciate you taking the time to explain all this to us. You've given us a wealth of information, and we will be releasing this video on YouTube and sharing it in the archives. We'll be putting all the links with your work in there. Is there anywhere that, if anybody wants to find your work, do you have a central website or a place that they might be able to find your work or contact you?
No, I gave up my website some years ago, but you can certainly search under my name, Martin Pall, Pall, and Electromagnetic, and you can find all kinds of stuff. The 90-page document that I wrote, you can search for with the date on it, which was May 17th, 2018, and you can again, for my name, Electromagnetic, you can put 5G in there, and you should be able to find it and download it. Let me just say that. There's one other thing I think we really ought to talk about with regard to 5G, because if you got a minute or two.
Yeah, go for it.
So the industry has been claiming that 5G, because of the millimeter waves, won't penetrate into the body, so that it'll only work in the outer 1 millimeter or so of the body, and therefore they claim we don't have to worry about effects that occur more deeply. I've been predicting that's not true, although there is a lot of effects at the surface, and so there are big effects at the surface that affect all organisms essentially, and that's a big problem because most organisms actually have more surface area and are more exposed than we are, including even very large trees, because their leaves and reproductive organs are highly exposed. On the other hand, we know that microwave frequency EMFs work vastly more deeply than the industry claims is possible, like 40 times more deeply, at least. And I predict the same thing is true with 5G. And so what's interesting is that there were a couple of documents that were translated by the CIA. Russian language studies, which have shown, in fact, that the millimeter wave frequencies that 5G will entail, in fact, work much more deeply than the industry claims is possible. So, again, the industry puts out propaganda, and almost all of it is completely false.
So one question you just brought up into my mind related to that. When we're discussing millimeter waves, we remember a few years back there were people who were kind of protesting and trying to raise awareness or ask questions at least about the millimeter waves that they were being exposed to at the airport with the rapid scan machines, the body scanners. Is this also a concern?
Yes, it is. Yeah, and for the same reasons. Yeah, and no, this is a concern, and it's a big problem. I mean,
yeah, it's definitely a big problem.
I hate to say it so much. I hate to say these things so much because it sounds like it's a huge thing to protect yourself, and it is. That doesn't mean you can't do you can't do useful things. I mean, for instance, I access the internet every day because I have to for my work, but I do everything wired. I do not have Wi-Fi in my house. I use a wired keyboard. I use a wired mouse. I use a wired printer. So I don't have to generate any wireless communication in order to do that. And I even have a little screen over the. I have some materials over the screen, which also puts out radiation to at least lower that to some extent. So there are ways of protecting yourself, but it takes I mean, what we are doing is just totally insane. It is absolutely crazy, and it makes no sense whatsoever when you understand the science.
Well, thank you for educating us all on this information, and we will be posting all the links to everything you've discussed and making sure that our audience can find you and dig further into your work. And hopefully, if you're listening to this and you're hearing this for the first time and you're in Houston, you can send that information to the City Council and to the Mayor and help get some of Dr. Pall's work as well as the other studies that have been out there. So thank you again for your time, and appreciate you joining us on Freethinker Radio.
You're welcome.
All right, we'll talk to you soon.
Okay.
We're going to be right back with the song. We'll be